Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. They told me the island had a soul, but no one warned me it might not want to be known. It began with a silence too complete to be natural, an absence that pressed against the inside of my ears like water. I had come to Hawaii alone, seeking silence, not peace, never peace. I was too far past that. I needed something deeper, something closer to the raw edge of nothingness. Work had frayed my nerves into trembling threads. My sleep, when it came, was thin and sickly. I wanted to disappear into some remote corner of the world where no one knew my name and nothing asked to be understood. A friend had told me about a secluded rental on the Big Island's eastern coast, tucked between lava fields and jungle. No neighbors, no cell reception. Just a one-bedroom cottage standing crooked on black volcanic rock, facing a horizon of endless gray water. It sounded like a blank space, exactly what I wanted. I arrived late on a Friday just as the sun was bleeding into the ocean, an unremarkable suitcase in the trunk, and the taste of airplane coffee still sour on my tongue. The road that led to the cottage was barely a road at all, more a suggestion. Narrow, winding, sometimes lost entirely beneath the creeping roots of trees I couldn't name. My rental car protested with every bump, but I forced it forward, mile after agonizing mile, until the jungle thinned and the ocean reared up ahead. The cottage stood alone, a gray structure that seemed older than wood should allow. There was a lean to the walls, as if the house had grown tired of standing. I killed the engine and stepped out into air so quiet it rang. The sound of my own breathing was offensive. The keys had been left in a box by the door as promised. The front steps groaned beneath me. Not loud, just enough to suggest pain. When I pushed open the door, a breath of cool, stale air greeted me, carrying with it the ghost of burnt sage and something saltier. The interior was simple. Wooden floorboards, pale walls, a bed, a kitchen, and an old bookshelf half filled with crumbling volumes. One window overlooked the sea. Another faced the dense tangle of forest. I unpacked without ceremony. My body moved automatically, robotically, as though the silence had infected my muscles. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and only a single lamp that cast light the color of bruised peaches. Outside, the sun finished dying, and the jungle exhaled a low, continuous hum I didn't realize was there until it stopped, abruptly and completely, sometime past midnight. I woke to that stillness, not to a noise, to the sudden, palpable absence of noise, the kind of silence that seems to suck the warmth from the world. It pressed against the cottage like a wall, thick and expectant. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the fan above me unmoving despite the switch I was sure I had flipped before falling asleep. My mouth was dry, my limbs heavy. There was a smell, faint but clinging, like wet stone or old bone. Something urged me to stay in bed, something deeper than fear, a wordless certainty that movement would be noticed. But I was not a man ruled by instincts. I had made a career out of ignoring my own body's screams. So I rose. Each floorboard groaned in slow protest beneath my bare feet. I moved to the kitchen, filled a glass with tap water, and stared out through the window into nothingness. No lights, no shapes, just darkness so thick it pulsed. I couldn't even see the tree line, but I could feel it. Something out there was watching the house. Not from a single vantage point, but from every angle, as if the jungle itself had leaned forward to study me. There was no proof. Nothing moved. And yet, I backed away from the window and returned to bed. I lay perfectly still and stared at the ceiling until dawn arrived, not with light, but with color, the sky turning green, then gray, before the sun finally bled through the clouds in a sickly yellow smear. I told myself it was jet lag, island nerves, unfamiliar bed. Saturday passed in a strange haze. I wandered the grounds, hiking across the black rock that crunched like brittle glass underfoot. The trees loomed, huge and wet and ancient. They didn't move with the wind. They pulsed. They breathed. There were small things, barely perceptible. The path behind me never looked quite the same when I turned. The trees shifted subtly, their trunks leaning together like whispering men. Birds flew overhead, but I never heard their calls. Even the insects were silent. At the edge of the forest, I found stones arranged in a spiral. Not natural, deliberate. Lava rock, smooth and oiled, forming a tight pattern the size of a child's grave. I told myself someone had made it for fun, but the earth inside the spiral was dead, bone dry, untouched by time or growth. The surrounding grass refused to lean inward. I stepped back without realizing it, and didn't look at it again. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the silence beat like a drum. There was no breeze, and yet the curtain moved. No animals, yet I heard scratching, soft, deliberate, inside the walls. My breath caught when I saw the first shape. It began as a suggestion in the corner of the room, just beyond the lamp's flickering reach. A darker patch in the dark. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But it grew, slowly, hour by hour, like a shadow remembering its shape. I never blinked. I couldn't. At some point, the lamp went out. The power was gone. So was the noise. Even the hum in the walls, the electric promise of modernity was gone. There was nothing. And in that perfect nothing, I felt the shape turn toward me. Not with eyes, but with intention. It didn't advance. It didn't threaten. It simply waited. I don't remember sleeping, but I must have, because I woke up on the floor. The window was open. Dirt streaked the boards, and at the base of the bed, footprints, human, bare, but wrong. The toes were too long, curved like hooks, and the heel barely touched, as though the walker had moved by choice on the balls of their feet, predatory and light. I packed my things without thinking. I needed to leave, to drive, to move, to find noise. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that broke whatever spell I'd been under. The sea was gone. Where yesterday the ocean stretched endlessly, now there was only rock. Miles and miles of black, craggy, wet volcanic stone, still steaming in the morning light, as though the water had peeled back like a skin, retreating from something unspeakable. I screamed, a sound so sudden and raw it felt foreign, and the jungle answered. Not with sound, but with motion. The trees shifted, their branches parting like curtains. Something enormous stirred in their depths. Not seen, never fully seen, but felt. The same way you feel the mass of a ship underwater, or the size of a nightmare before you wake. I backed toward the house and saw the spiral of stones again. Larger now, impossibly large, stretching toward the open sea. I blinked, and the pattern had changed. The center of the spiral was no longer dry. It was wet, soaked with something darker than blood. I locked the door behind me, not knowing why, and sat in the middle of the floor with every light on, though they pulsed dimly, like dying stars. The books on the shelf had changed. I hadn't noticed before, but now, none were in English. Some were handwritten. Some bled. One hummed. The shadows were moving again. Not fast, not aggressively, but with purpose. I closed my eyes. The house was breathing. I could feel the boards swell and fall beneath me. The air inside the room grew thick like syrup, clinging to my skin, coating my lungs. And I knew. This was not a place I had come to. This was a place that had called, and I had answered. I do not remember Sunday, not in full, only in pieces. The whisper of drums at dawn, the sky, wrong, bending at the edges like wet film, the trees opening wide, a hand, not flesh, but stone, pressing gently against my chest and holding me still. I remember walking, through the jungle, through tunnels of green that led downward even as I walked forward. The ground became soft, then warm, then hot. My feet bled. The air shimmered. There were faces in the leaves, eyes that never blinked, mouths that smiled without lips. I followed a path I never chose. The spiral was inside me now, beating like a second heart. At the center, I found a pool, black as pitch, still as glass. I did not see my reflection, only depth. Something moved beneath the surface, slow, aware, vast. I knelt, I reached, and then I was back, on the plane, a window seat, my suitcase underfoot, my clothes damp, my hands raw. The stewardess smiled at me, but her eyes were blank. Outside, the clouds parted. I saw the island beneath us, and it blinked. Not metaphorically, not as a poet might say. The island blinked. A single, vertical, black slit stretching the length of the jungle. The spiral was carved into its surface now, vast and seething. I have not spoken of it until now. Not because I am afraid, not even because I still hear the drums in my sleep, but because I was not the only one on that plane. And last night, I found stones outside my apartment door, arranged in a perfect spiral, still wet. And when I looked up at my ceiling, it was breathing. I saw him once and only once, yet his presence has never left me. Even now, years later, his memory clings to the corners of my mind like the smell of damp leaves rotting under the weight of autumn. Halloween night has always had a strange, brittle quiet where I'm from. I grew up in a town so small it barely qualified as a town at all. A few crooked roads lined with older houses that leaned like weary men, and trees so tall and gnarled that they looked more like skeletons than anything that had once bloomed. Trick-or-treating had been dead for years. Parents said it was too dangerous, too dark, too far between houses. But that Halloween, I was 29, recently unemployed and staying at my late grandmother's house while figuring out what the next step would be. I hadn't planned anything special, just silence, solitude, and a bottle of wine as company. The house was a relic, 3 stories tall and built long before electricity was standard. The wiring was questionable, the radiators groaned like they were in pain, and the windows rattled even when there was no wind. My grandmother had died in that house, in the very same bed where she had been born. The sort of thing you'd find poetic if it didn't make your skin crawl. She had always said the house was deep. I never understood what she meant, until that night. Around 9:30 p.m., I turned off the television and lit a few candles. The glow seemed gentler than the brittle fluorescent lighting, and I liked the way the flames bent and quivered, like they were listening to something I couldn't hear. The wine warmed me just enough to forget the cold seeping through the floorboards, and I settled into the armchair by the parlor window. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A tall figure standing completely still under the maple tree by the street. Not moving, not shifting. No flashlight, no costume. Just there. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe someone waiting for a ride. Maybe a kid playing a prank. But as the minutes passed, he didn't move. He stood there with unnatural stillness, like a misplaced piece of furniture in an otherwise familiar room. The street lamp above him flickered once, then again, and the third time it pulsed, the figure was gone. I would have convinced myself I'd imagined it, but something had changed. I could feel the house noticing. The pipes clicked louder. The wind became a breath against the windows, and deep inside me, something began to twist. Not fear exactly, but anticipation. The way animals sense the moment before a storm arrives. I decided to go to bed. Sleep would wipe away the wine and the strange unease that had begun to settle around me like dust. I climbed the narrow stairs, each one groaning beneath my feet, and entered the bedroom at the end of the hall, the same one where my grandmother had died. The room was heavy with her scent. Not perfume, but something older. Paper, dust, earth. The candlelight stretched my shadow across the floorboards, distorting it with every flicker. I shut the door behind me, though I didn't remember doing it, and crawled into the bed. The sheets were too cold and the mattress had a subtle, almost imperceptible dip, like someone had been sleeping there all this time. I must have drifted off, though I'm not sure when. But when I awoke, The candle was out, and the room was absolutely crushingly dark. Not a single thread of light from the hallway. No sound, no movement. Just blackness, like the house had buried me alive inside itself. And then I heard it. A sound I will never forget. The slow, careful tread of someone descending the stairs. Not ascending, descending. As though someone had entered from the attic above, where there had never been a door. The steps were deliberate, each one pressing into the house's bones with an unbearable weight. I held my breath, straining to hear, my body frozen with the kind of terror that belongs to prey. When the footsteps reached the second floor, they stopped. Silence. And then a slow dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wood, something not entirely alive. I don't know how long I lay there before I realized something else. The air had changed. It wasn't just cold. It was thin. My chest felt tight, my limbs heavy. The darkness pressed inward like a living thing, curious and suffocating. And then I heard the doorknob turn. Not fast, not violent, just a smooth, almost polite rotation, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted me to hear it. But the door didn't open, it just clicked. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the morning light finally trickled in through the cracks around the curtains, I found the door slightly ajar. Not open, not closed. Just waiting, as if it had been held there by a hand that had only recently let go. I should have left then. I knew I should have. But something about the house and that Halloween night had pulled me in too deep. The next night, it returned. Not the figure, but the feeling. I stayed up, candles lit, listening to the silence. I could feel it circling the house like a shark, brushing against the walls, testing the windows. Around 3 a.m., the hallway light turned on by itself. Just once. Long enough to cast a silhouette at the top of the stairs. It wasn't human, not quite. Too tall, too thin, limbs too long for the frame. And in the instant before the light went out again, I saw its head tilt. Not in curiosity, but recognition, like it remembered me. I locked myself in the bedroom again, but this time I noticed something I hadn't before. A crack in the corner of the ceiling. A thin, jagged line that seemed to pulse gently, like the skin of something breathing. I couldn't look away. My eyes burned, but I stared until the candle sputtered out and the room folded into itself. Each night after that, the line grew longer, and each day, the house grew quieter. No birds outside, no passing cars. The phone line died and my cell lost signal. Even the light through the windows began to fade, like the sun no longer reached this stretch of land. I was sinking, inch by inch, into a version of reality that did not obey the rules of time or space. It wasn't until I ventured into the attic that I understood what my grandmother had meant by the house being deep. The door was hidden behind a bookcase I'd never tried to move. I only found it because the crack from the ceiling had finally reached the floor and disappeared beneath that bookshelf like a trail. I opened it on the 5th night. The staircase beyond was impossibly narrow, and the air smelled of mildew and iron. The walls were lined with old, discolored portraits, all of people whose eyes had been scratched out. Some of them looked like family, some of them looked like me. At the top, the attic was nothing like I expected. It wasn't full of old boxes or forgotten furniture. It was empty, except for a single chair facing the far corner, where something impossibly tall and still stood, turned away from me. I couldn't see its face. I didn't need to. The moment I stepped into that room, I remembered it. Not from dreams or stories, but from something buried so deep in my bloodline that even my bones ached with recognition. It turned slowly, deliberately. And what faced me was not a face at all, but a void. A hollowness so complete that it felt like looking into the raw center of death itself. And then it stepped forward. I don't remember running. I don't remember escaping. I only know that I woke up in the yard, barefoot, bleeding, and covered in ash. The house was silent behind me. No light, no movement, just that unending sense that I had been touched by something that does not belong in this world. I left the house that morning, drove until the gas tank hit empty, slept in the car, ate whatever I could get at gas stations, and refused to look at the rearview mirror for weeks. I never went back, but Halloween always brings it closer. Even now, I wake at 3 a.m. every year on that night, never by choice. The candles in my apartment blow out, the temperature drops, and sometimes just for a second I see that figure in the corner of my room, watching, waiting. Every year the crack in the ceiling returns, and every year it grows a little longer. I think it's following me. Or worse, maybe it never left. Because once you see it, once you let it in, it's not just a stranger on Halloween night, it's yours forever. I've come to believe that the forest doesn't want you to leave once it's remembered you. Not the trees or the soil or the wildlife, but the deeper thing beneath it all. The watcher with no face, the breath you can't feel, the cold that nestles into your bones and waits. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, one of those deliberate escapes from the noise of modern life. I had been unraveling in slow, imperceptible ways, the kind of fraying that doesn't draw blood, but wears on the soul. I chose Hollow Glen not for its reputation, but for its obscurity. No reviews, no signs, just a fading trail tucked behind a broken wooden fence at the edge of some forgotten county road. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, one of those deliberate escapes from the noise of modern life. I had been unraveling in slow, imperceptible ways, the kind of fraying that doesn't draw blood but wears on the soul. I chose Hollow Glen not for its reputation, but for its obscurity. No reviews, no signs, just a fading trail tucked behind a broken wooden fence at the edge of some forgotten county road. The air shifted the moment I passed through that gate, though I didn't know how to name it then. Not wind or weather, more like the thinning of something unseen. The trees stood differently here, not tangled or wild, but poised, like an audience. I hiked for nearly 3 hours, the path narrowing until it dissolved entirely, leaving me with nothing but instinct and sun-filtered moss to guide my steps. I should have turned back when I lost the trail, but the forest had a way of luring you deeper without resistance. A soft hum in the leaves, a rhythm in the wind, as if I were being gently led. When I found the clearing, it was already dusk. The light had turned copper, casting long, soft shadows that danced along the glade. In the center stood a flat stone, unnaturally smooth, as if eroded by centuries of water, though no river ran nearby. It didn't feel right, but I was too tired to question it. I set up camp just outside the clearing's edge, where the underbrush thinned and the air felt breathable again. That first night, the silence was unbearable, not peaceful, oppressive. I realized how much of the forest's life had been absent since I arrived. No crickets, no distant owl, not even the rustle of branches in the breeze, just the hollow stillness of watching eyes. I slept lightly, drifting in and out of something between dream and paralysis. Every time I stirred, I found myself on the edge of the clearing, always facing that stone, always cold with dew, though I'd gone to bed wrapped in a thermal blanket. At first, I thought it was sleepwalking, a trick of exhaustion, but after the third night, when I woke lying atop the stone itself, I began to understand that I was not the only thing moving in the dark. The mornings were stranger still. My supplies were untouched, but my boots would be damp and filled with leaves. My hands had streaks of dirt under the nails, as if I'd been digging. I would find small cairns arranged at the forest's edge, little towers of stone and bone that hadn't been there the night before. One even had a scrap of my shirt tied to the top, knotted neatly like a flag. I stopped cooking. I stopped speaking aloud. Something about noise felt sacrilegious here, like it would draw attention from places best left undisturbed. Instead, I listened. And I heard things, not voices, not sounds exactly, but impressions. The crack of a branch without motion, a sigh in the soil, the uncanny echo of breath inside my own tent that wasn't mine. On the fifth night, I didn't sleep. I laid awake staring at the seams of the tent fabric, tracking the way the moonlight bent unnaturally through the canopy, carving shapes on the nylon walls. Just past midnight, I saw the silhouette, not walking, but gliding. The figure was impossibly tall, shoulders too narrow, head bowed. It passed without footsteps, without effort, casting no shadow against the moonlit earth. I closed my eyes, and it was inside the tent, without a sound. But when I opened them again, I was alone. I didn't leave the next day, not because I didn't want to, but because the path was gone. I don't mean overgrown. I mean it wasn't there. The trees had closed in behind me like a wound knitting shut. I walked for hours in every direction, compass spinning, sun refusing to move from its place in the sky. I came back to the clearing each time, more tired, more frayed. The forest began to open itself to me in pieces. I found a circle of blackened trees with their bark peeled upward, exposing raw, sapless flesh. I discovered a burial mound too symmetrical to be natural, marked with rows of hand-carved runes etched into slate. There were offerings, bones stacked with dried berries, antlers painted with some ochre dye, and crude effigies made of ash-bound twigs. They were recent, and some bore symbols I recognized from my own dreams. Dreams that no longer felt like fiction. I began to forget the sound of cars, of voices, of the digital world I had left behind. My phone was dead by the second day. Not drained, dead. The screen blackened, the battery bloated like a corpse. I buried it out of instinct. Some primitive guilt at the intrusion of modernity. I don't know when exactly I stopped feeling afraid. There's a moment where fear gives way to awe, not the joyful kind, but the type that hollows you out. The realization that you are a thread in a much older tapestry, one not woven with human hands. By the 8th day, or what I believe to be the 8th, I stopped eating. Hunger no longer hurt. My skin had grown pale, translucent in places, as though the forest light had begun to filter through me instead of over me. I could see veins like roots, pulsing with some deeper rhythm that didn't align with my heartbeat. I no longer slept, only faded in and out of lucidity, with no way to measure the transitions. And the forest began to speak, not with words but with memory. I would blink and find myself watching scenes I couldn't have lived. A girl kneeling by the flat stone, chanting with hands covered in pitch. A man weeping as he carved his own face into bark, then buried the pieces beside the burial mound. A circle of figures standing in silence as the sky bled red, all of them turning at once to look directly at me. Each time I returned to myself, my body bore signs, scratches that scabbed and disappeared within hours, fingers stained with dark soil, a mouthful of petals I hadn't eaten. On the final morning, I woke submerged in a shallow pool at the base of a mossy slope. The water was impossibly still, reflecting a sky I didn't recognize, one too deep and starlit for morning. My eyes stung with a cold so intense it felt like glass behind the lids. I rose shivering and the stone clearing was gone. In its place was a wide ring of bare earth, smoldering slightly, steam rising in the shape of branching veins. In the center stood the tall figure, still faceless, but now luminous. Not with light, but with absence. Its presence devoured all warmth, all direction. My breath didn't fog in its presence. My heart didn't beat. There was no sound, no wind, only the soundless pressure of significance. I understood then. I was not being haunted. I was being chosen. The forest, or whatever lived beneath it, was not malevolent in the way humans define malice. It was indifferent. Older than gods. It did not punish. It assimilated. I don't remember leaving. At least, not with my body. I came to awareness months later, or maybe years. I can't tell. In my apartment, clothes damp with the rot scent of pine, feet caked in mud. My calendar was unchanged. My plants had not wilted. Time had not passed, but I had. I tried to speak of it once, just once, to a friend I trusted. The words came out broken, fevered, as if my tongue no longer belonged to the same alphabet. I watched his expression curdle with concern. I didn't try again. Instead, I visit places like this, quiet corners of the internet where people share stories that no one believes. I listen. I wait. I wonder if any of them have seen the trees bend inward, or felt the call of that ancient silence humming beneath their feet. Because sometimes I feel it still, the echo of leaves against skin, the absence that watches from the mirror, the wet roots that bloom behind my eyes when I sleep too long, and the forest, that forest, it hasn't forgotten me. The trees are patient, and something has started growing beneath my floorboards. The city instantly fell silent, a quiet that wasn't so much muzzling the noise as swallowing it whole, as if the air itself had become heavy and oppressive, crushing, choking, unnatural. I spent that first night standing at my window, watching downtown Los Angeles streets vanish beneath a heavy, unnatural fog. It crawled like something living, slow and unhurried, over neon signs and streetlights. There was no hum of distant traffic, no footsteps, no sirens, no sound, just stillness, punctuated periodically by the soft scritch of something somewhere, like claws dragged across asphalt, too deliberate to be random. I remember the weight of that silence, how it settled deep in my chest, each breath a battle, as if I were sucking in something less than air. It felt wrong. This was their lockdown, they announced, officially a mandatory quarantine due to an unnamed biohazard threat. But the beat of the city had come this close to any announcement of a virus for me to hear. The streets emptied overnight, but the shadows remained, stretched out, bent, and in some way watching. The days went by, slipping through my fingers like smoke. Lockdown time was not a line but a circle, moving on in a loop on itself. The sun came up and went down behind a curtain of heavy gray cloud, never actually breaking through, never sparking warmth. The light was off as if it passed through some cracked old prism. Underneath that drippy fluorescent light, my apartment cooled even the heaters. Walls breathed out damp, earthy cold, a scent of wet stone and rotting leaves. It clung to my skin, seeped through my clothes. Sometimes I could have sworn to hear words whispered beneath the whine of the heater, unmaking but repeated like wisps of forgotten tongue curling from the corners of the room. The internet was spotty in the beginning, then went out altogether. My phone went dead. My laptop lost contact with the world. Left by myself, the quiet became more oppressive, a suffocating pressure that closed in on all sides. Nights were the worst. The city outside, which had once bristled with a restless life, was now a graveyard. Dark pooled in the streets, oozing under shut doors and broken windows. It crept with the sluggish, unnatural fluidity of something living that had come to haunt the empty boulevards. I tried to sleep at first. My dreams were interrupted and strange, collapsing into a realm where the familiar became a horror. I moved along infinite streets with shattered mirrors that only reflected emptiness. Faces snapped back at me, weak, twisted and silent, eyes empty like black pits. I awoke one evening to the gentle murmur of chanting, rhythmic and low, echoing between the walls. I rested against the chill plaster and held my ear against it, but it disappeared. I told myself it was a dream, a fantasy induced by isolation and fear, but the smell of burned herbs lingered in the air, faint but familiar. In the coming days, I could feel changes in myself. My skin turned pale and stretched taut. My fingers trembled with an unshakable cold. The mirror was a scary place, my face sometimes behind, other times distorted, mouth jerking into a smile I had not made, eyes glinting with an appetite I did not have. There were times, brief and nightmare-spiring, when the room would slope, walls bending inward like a funnel, ceiling dipping down like a suffocating lid. The floor beneath my feet hummed with a slow, thudding beat that wasn't mine. I started to inscribe symbols in the dust on my windowsill, Simple geometric shapes, circles within triangles, lines crossing over and recrossing, straining for a pattern, some semblance of control in this collapsing world. Then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate raps, always at midnight. There was no one else living in my apartment building. I knew this, and yet could not ignore the sound. Sometimes the knocking was heard from inside the walls, dry, hollow, like wood against wood. I never opened the door. I put my ear up against it instead, and heard beneath the knocks a faraway air, an ancient, lugubrious melody, unrecognizable but solidly disturbing, such as a dirge from before time. One such night the knocks ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. The door handle thereafter moved creakily round, a thin chink in the quiet. I was trying not to breathe, heart thudding like a mad drum, but no one entered. Weeks passed without change. I grew gaunt, skeletal in hunger and despair, living on canned rations and stale water. The city was still trapped in its ghostly quiet. Nobody departed. Nobody came. One evening, when the sun went down behind a wall of rolling fog, I ventured forth for the first time. The atmosphere was filled with rot and a metallic scent, rust and blood mixed. The streets were a canvas of shadows and quiet. I walked blindly, drawn by some deeper urge than terror. The fog enveloped me, chill and clammy, curling into my garments, dripping down my hair. The streetlights flickered weakly, half resisting the darkness. I strolled by a shattered storefront and noted motion, a presence standing just behind the shroud of mist. Tall and gaunt, its shape twirling like smoke, there were no distinguishing features. I came to a halt, heart aching in spasm, but the figure didn't budge or speak. It simply watched. I turned and ran back to my flat, each nerve on edge. That night, sleep disappeared completely. I perched in my window, eyes open into the black void of the street. Then suddenly the power failed. The room was black. The silence enveloped me, heavier than ever before. I felt a presence in the darkness, something ancient, indifferent, and gigantic, leaning just beyond the fragile edge of my apartment walls. My mind unraveled. Memories intruded, fractured images of a city not as it had ever been. Streets twisting into labyrinths, buildings gaining organic and living qualities, pulsating with an unsuspectable life. The air tasted bitter. I heard a distant chorus, voices rising in harmony, chanting in a tongue older than mankind, summoning something beyond the stars. Nights blurred into days, and the lockdown had its hold, not on the city, but on my mind. Time had lost all meaning, reality itself. Shadows danced at the perimeter of my perception, hinting at secrets I could not read but could not overcome. I inscribed mad hieroglyphs in a notebook, trying to make sense of the signs I found traced on walls when the fog momentarily cleared. They were not human-made marks, too clean, too deliberate, as if the city was leaving me a message to unravel. I knew at that point that this lockdown was more than a quarantine, but a ritual, an invocation. The city was a vessel, a door between our world and something vast and hungry. At night, when the fog rolled into an unfathomable black, I could sense the walls closing in closer than before. The knocking came back, louder, more urgent, faster now, more insistently. I got up and pressed my hand against the door, feeling the cold seep through the wood, the pulse beneath it. A heartbeat not my own, insistent and rhythmic. The handle turned once more, slowly, with deliberation. This time, I did not flee. As the creaking door pushed itself open, a cold gust of air swept in, the earthy odor of soil and ash and something utterly, unbiddably old on the chill. The shadow coalesced at the door like a puddle of dark ink, tendrils extending, ravenous and infinite. I understood in that moment that the lockdown wasn't meant to keep us in. It was meant to keep something out. But the door was already open. I have not left my apartment since. I sit and write these words in fading light, and I wonder if the sun will ever rise again, or if the fog will sweep over the city in a great devouring. The silence has expanded into a presence, a living thing, waiting patiently for me to surrender. The shadows talk now, no longer shattered but clear, a call of limitless cosmic terror promising a reality too vast to comprehend. I'm not sure if I'm crazy or awake. All I know is that the lockdown was never for a virus. It was for the city itself, a portal, a sacrifice, an old vow in blood and stone. And now I wait, waiting for the darkness to come inside. There is no escape. Not in LA, not in the lockdown, not in this city where the silence listens back. It began with the sound of rain, though I never heard it start. I had simply found myself standing by the living room window, transfixed by the rhythm of water tapping the glass like skeletal fingers drumming insistently against a coffin lid. The sky had not darkened gradually as it usually did during a summer storm. It was just dark, utterly and immediately, as if the sun had abandoned its place. I should have turned on the lights, but I didn't. There was something almost sacred in that gray, shimmering hush, the way the lamplight outside bled softly into the slick pavement, and how the trees shivered beneath the wind's breath. My house, an old colonial structure I'd inherited from my grandmother, sat at the end of a wooded road, isolated, flanked by swaying pines and a weeping willow that often sounded like it whispered in the breeze. On such a night, I became profoundly aware of how far I was from other people, and how close I was to something else. I had returned to the house only 3 weeks prior after nearly a decade of city life. I told myself it was for the peace, for the solitude, to finish my writing and escape the spiraling chaos of urban disillusionment. But something deeper had driven me here, an intangible pull I could not name. A yearning not just for silence, but for ancestral silence. The kind that hums just beneath the world's noise. The rain grew heavier. I noticed it not in sound, but in the way the window panes quivered as though the storm possessed weight. I wandered from the window into the hallway, feeling the wood beneath my bare feet cool and uneven. This house had shifted over time. It creaked with memory. And memory, I was beginning to understand, was not always yours to command. That night, though I would not have admitted it then, felt wrong from the moment I woke. There was a hum in the air, low and pervasive, not audible, but felt deep in the spine. It reminded me of the way silence sometimes isn't truly silent if you're paying close enough attention. Something was happening, something subtle. I passed the mirror in the hall and hesitated. There was no reason to stop, no flicker of movement, no shadow flitting past. But I stood still nonetheless. The reflection looked normal, a slightly pale version of myself in sweatpants, the dim outline of furniture behind me, and yet I did not remember walking into the hallway. I had been by the window. I reached a hand toward the mirror. My fingers met cool glass. Just a mirror, just me. But a strange sensation passed through me, like I'd touched the surface of still water and disturbed something slumbering beneath it. I returned to the living room. The rain had stopped. No, it hadn't. It still tapped the windows, but outside the world was frozen. The wind no longer moved the branches. The leaves hung motionless. Even the distant orange glow of the street lamp seemed to flicker in place, like an old film caught in a loop. I stepped back, heart knocking once against my ribs like a warning. The house, usually full of small sounds, pipes ticking, the old furnace exhaling in slow breaths, was silent. The kind of silence that listens back. The storm didn't move through the world, it moved around it. I returned to the study, hoping distraction might be enough to dispel the unease threading through me. I sat at the old writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. She'd kept strange things in its drawers, bird skulls, melted candles, brittle pages with symbols inked in red. I'd thrown much of it out, or so I thought. The drawer wouldn't open. I hadn't locked it. I hadn't even touched it since moving in. Still, it refused to budge. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the wood. Nothing. But the surface felt warm, and from within, I cannot explain this, it felt as though something pulsed. I left the study. I wandered room to room, turning on lights as I went. It offered no comfort. Each bulb buzzed faintly, a sharp little whine at the edge of hearing, like insects trapped inside the glass. Light revealed very little. Shadows clung to corners like stains that had soaked too deep to scrub clean. It was when I entered the kitchen that I realized I was not alone. There was a wet trail on the linoleum floor. Footsteps, bare, human, but not mine. I hadn't entered the kitchen since morning. These prints were fresh, smudged at the heel, too long in the toe. They began by the back door, but the door was locked. I touched the prints. They were warm. That night unraveled slowly, like a thread tugged by an unseen hand. I tried to reason it away. An overactive mind, residual dreams clinging to consciousness. But the deeper into the house I walked, the less it felt like mine. In the guest room, I found the bed stripped bare, the mattress pulled askew. A circle of salt had been poured onto the floor in the corner, jagged and imperfect. At its center, a bundle of feathers wrapped in what looked like skin. I approached it with breath held. I had never done this, I had never seen it before. Yet it looked familiar. It smelled faintly of lavender and rot. In the hallway, the photographs had changed. My family's smiling faces stared blankly now, all color drained from their eyes. One image, a faded portrait of my grandmother as a child, seemed newer than it had before. It was sharper, clearer. In it, her hands were clasped behind her back, but the longer I looked, the more I became convinced that something was in those hands. Something small and twitching. The power flickered. I stood perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. It wasn't that I feared being heard. It was that I feared confirming what I already suspected, that I was being watched. Not by the house, but by something using the house. It was near midnight when the whispers began. They came not from a direction, but from within the walls themselves. Murmurs without language, like memory trying to speak. I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chest, heart loud enough to feel in my teeth. The whispering did not stop. It grew louder, then fell away, then returned again, always just quiet enough to make me question it. The lights blinked again. This time they didn't return. The darkness was complete. Somewhere below I heard a thud, not loud, just final. I sat up. Rain struck the roof in waves now, like something pacing above me. The windows rattled. I felt the house breathe. Every step I took toward the stairs felt like a descent into something I'd never meant to awaken. The basement door was ajar. I had not opened it. It exhaled cold air like a mouth parting after a long sleep. The steps creaked as I descended, not beneath my feet but before them, each stair groaning a moment before I stepped, as though anticipating me. At the base I found something waiting. A shallow basin etched into the stone floor. Surrounding it were candles, some burned down to wax puddles, others flickering despite no visible flame. Within the basin, water, still, black. I looked into it, and I saw the house. But wrong. The walls were flesh, the windows blinking eyes, the doors mouths opened in silent scream. And within that reflection I saw myself, smiling. I stumbled back. My hand brushed against something on the wall. A drawing, crude, scrawled in ash and oil. A figure, arms outstretched, towering over smaller forms that knelt in worship. Its head was a spiral. Beneath it, a name scratched again and again in the stone. Letters I couldn't read, but I understood them. I remembered them. I left the basement, though I do not recall walking back up. I found myself in the hallway again. My reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the wall behind me. I waved a hand. Nothing. No image. Just absence. A dream, I told myself. A nightmare. But nightmares end. This did not. I heard the front door open, though the lock had not turned. Wind screamed through the house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something sweetly rotted. I backed into the living room. The window was no longer there. In its place was a wall, seamless, as though the house had sealed itself shut. I was not alone. I never had been. The storm never ended. It rains now, always. The same sound, the same tapping. I do not know how many days have passed. The clocks do not move. The sun does not rise. There is only gray. Sometimes I see myself walking the halls. A version of me I do not recognize. It smiles too much. It does not blink. I think it lives in the mirror now. I no longer look into it. In the study, the drawer has opened. Inside, a letter in handwriting I do not recognize, though it feels like my own. It simply says, "You came home." It remembered you. I am beginning to understand now. The house is not haunted. It is worshipped. It is a temple not built to keep things in, but to invite things through. The rain is not weather. It is a veil. Each drop a mouth. Each shadow a memory, relearning its shape. My grandmother did not leave this house. She became it. And soon I think I will too. In June 2017, the world around me lost that tangible feel. I recall the way shadows started to stretch too far, and how my own reflection one morning blinked a whole second later than mine. I hadn't intended to go back to the cabin. It was not somewhere I'd been since my grandfather passed away, and even then, I'd merely hung around long enough to pack up some yellow maps, a dozen notebooks full of his illegible writing, and the rough wooden trinkets he carved every night as the fire murmured soft behind him. But in the summer of 2017, after a series of sleepless nights and a recurring dream about a black sky filled with motionless stars, I was driving to the north woods of Vermont, it seemed, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of an instinct older than reason. The cabin itself was perched on the rim of an old clearing, nestled into a thick crown of pines and birch, their trunks a white chorus and moss-darkened whispers. The roof leaned a bit more than I recalled, and windows, which had once shone clear, had acquired the muffled gloss of cataracts. The lock I had taken with me from the city still worked, and when the door creaked open, it groaned like something stirring from a deep, acrid slumber. Dust whirled in slivers of sunlight that streamed through the slanted windows, as if it had been disturbed by breath. The air was heavy with pine resin and ash, but under that, something acuter, metallic, like blood on rocks or iron extracted from the depths of water. I remained in the doorway for more time than I intended, taking slow breaths, waiting for a sign of movement in the quiet. There was none. I stepped inside with a reluctance that felt at once foreign and passed down. The first night was still. No automobiles, no far-off hum of electricity, no light of artificial illumination, just the infinite quiet of trees and the electronic hiss of bugs somewhere out past the timberline. I lit the fireplace not for warmth, but because I wanted a noise, a beat, a rhythm to keep time in the suffocating quiet. I had packed books, journals, a bit of food. No internet, no service. That was by design. I reminded myself I had come to write, to reboot, to unspool. But deep beneath the surface of those rational explanations, something more primitive stirrings. Something had summoned me here, and I had come, not out of desire, but duty. It was during about the third night that the dreams restarted. The dreams weren't unfamiliar. I'd had versions of them for years, always in the periphery of sleep. A dark forest, a clearing, shapes like statues or watchers standing still with no eyes and no faces. But in the cabin they intensified, stretching into wakefulness, refusing to end with the morning sun. I would awake with a sense of having run miles, my feet pounding, my lungs burning as if I had been sprinting. The covers would be all knotted and wet with sweat, my body covered in the sheen of a terror I didn't recall. The cabin would be too thick with air, too hot, the fire having used up all the oxygen and filled it with something older, heavier. Then there were the footprints. They started as smudges on the wood floor. Only two. Bare feet, faint and damp, like someone had come in from the woods after rain. But it hadn't rained in days. I wiped them away, lied to myself I had tracked something in. The following night there were more. Every subsequent night the footprints increased. They started close to the fireplace and extended towards the back room. the one my grandfather had locked until he passed away. I had never ventured there, even after becoming the owner of the property. The key was still in the same rusted tin he'd stored it in, hidden behind the mantel. I didn't sleep the first night I used it. The lock fought. Not the way that old locks do, but with a kind of mechanical reluctance. When it finally clicked, the noise reverberated in my chest like a cough in a crypt. The door creaked open onto darkness. There were no windows, no furniture, nothing but floorboards and dust, and a symbol etched into the wall on the far side of the room. A circular symbol, but not rounded. Unclean, rough, etched deep enough into the wood that it seemed almost like a wound. The lines curled like vines or arms curling back upon themselves in impossible shapes, like halfway between a spiral and a trap, and in the middle a solitary black stone, smooth, motionless, cold to the eye in a way that made my breathing shallow. It was on the floor as if it had always been there. I did not touch it when I left the room, but I could not get it out of my head. The days ran together. I ceased to look at the clock. I ceased to read. Even the fire started to feel like a performance, more a gesture toward heat than a means of it. The woods surrounding the cabin shifted as well. The birds fell silent. The trees seemed less like life and more like statues. Vigilance, guarding. Their branches twisted into positions that seemed wrong in an anatomical way. I began waking up to discover the door ajar. Never completely, only ajar. Enough to allow a sliver of the night, of the forest outside. Enough to make me question whether someone, or something, stood just beyond, listening, waiting. I put the bed up against the door after the fourth occurrence. That evening I dreamed of my grandfather. He was standing in the same room with the symbol, his back to me, his head cocked as if listening for a whisper I wasn't hearing. His attire was all wrong. Ritualistic, I suppose, made of dark material that caught the light like oil. On the floor around his feet, the footprints flowered, wet and infinite, all leading to the stone. He stooped down, touched it. When he turned to me, his eyes weren't his. They weren't human. I woke up screaming. For the first time, I thought of leaving, filling the car, driving until the cabin was out of mind and the dreams just a delirium memory. But I didn't. Because I knew, at some level, I couldn't. The forest wouldn't permit me. One afternoon, I discovered the journals. They weren't with the others I had retrieved years before. These had been stored under a floorboard in the rear room, wrapped with sinew rather than string. There were 4 of them. No titles. No dates. The writing was my grandfather's, though it had weakened toward the end, almost wild. The first several pages were concerned with the stone. He had discovered it, he said, after tracking a series of dreams much like my own. It called to him. It was not an artifact, he wrote. It was an entrance. He explained rituals, markings, sleep and wake cycles that ran together. He spoke of time folding in on itself, of voices that seemed to issue from below the floorboards, of an entity he referred to as the mouth beneath. He ceased signing his name towards the end of the last journal. Instead, every entry concluded with the same 3 words. It remembers me. Payoff. The last week I didn't sleep at all. The lights faded earlier every day. The sun never fully rose. My skin was like paper, dry, thin, brittle. I quit eating, quit talking out loud. I floated through the cabin like a ghost in my own skin. The stone never touched, but it warmed. One evening, perhaps the last, I went into the room once more. The symbol was different, or perhaps my eyes were. Its outlines throbbed. Its lines ran red. The stone vibrated with something too low to hear. I could feel it humming in my teeth. The floor around it was damp. I recall kneeling next to it, not to touch, but to hear. There was a noise. Quiet, like something swimming through water miles down. Then a whisper, so sharp it could have been inside my head. A name. My name. I woke up in the woods, unclothed and freezing. Behind me stood the cabin, but the door was missing. Just hunk of wall where it had stood. No windows, no fireplace. just a timber and rot frame with no entry or exit. I patrolled the perimeter for hours, shouted, no reply, no birds, no breeze, just the trees staring. I eventually lost hope and set walking. The forest didn't stop. Years now, I suppose. Time passes differently here. I do not hunger, not exactly. I sleep in flashes. I dream relentlessly. I see the faces of individuals I used to know, but they are off. Distorted forms, their eyes too large, their mouths too wide. I see symbols etched into trees, into stone, into the backs of creatures that run through the brush as if they've been sewn together by horror and nightmare. The rock is visible at times. It rests in new locations, on sloping hillsides, near riverbeds, once in the bend of a toppled tree. I do not touch it. I will not ever, but I listen. And I hear. I hear them. And now I recall. I recall everything. There was no 2017. Not truly. Merely an invitation. And I went. It was the wind that awakened me, not with a howl, but its absence. It was in that quiet that something within me stirred. Not memory, but a knowing, as old as blood. I hadn't meant to come back to the cabin. It remained on the edge of the family's lips, unsaid, unseen, but there. Following my father's passing, I discovered a key stuffed into an envelope with no letter, merely the coordinates written in faint, unstable handwriting. The cabin, the one I'd heard only in fragments and incomplete sentences, always preceded by embarrassed silence and rumblings towards the ground. It was in the middle of the northern forests, far from cell service, beyond the lights of towns that went wild by midnight. I drove until the pavement turned to gravel, the gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to moss and pine needles. The road itself turned into something indistinct, as though the world had started to remember it wasn't there. I arrived at the cabin just at dark, when the sun struggled behind the trees, and the sky had that bruised purple color. It was older than I had pictured. Squat, slumped under the burden of its own years, with twisted wood siding and windows that had been glazed in what had perhaps once been lace but now seemed like tissue-thin skin pulled over bone. Ivy crept up one side as if the earth itself was taking it back inch by inch. The air was thick, damp with rot and needles. I anticipated stillness, the quiet of isolation, but rather, I discovered depths of sound, the snap of insects, the groan of unseen trees, and beneath it all something more distant, like breathing, only just heard, not from myself, but around me. Inside, the air was chilly. The floor creaked underfoot, boards curving like fatigued lungs releasing air. Dust danced in rays of light like ashes from some extinguished flame. There was no light, only a cold stone hearth, dark and open-mouthed, and shelves crowded with books whose covers had been reduced to specters. What disturbed me first was not the strangeness of the place, but how familiar it felt. As though I had dreamed it often, in some fevered sleep I could never recall upon waking. There was a painting above the fireplace, an oil of the cabin itself, slightly off in proportion, with the surrounding trees leaning in toward it unnaturally, like sentinels bending to listen. That evening I slept in the upstairs bed, cocooned in worn wool that reeked faintly of cedar and something metal. Sleep did not come readily, and when it did, it was filled with impressions instead of dreams. Firelight that was not warm creeping along walls, quiet footsteps treading just beyond the door, and voices which did not use words but tones. Some sort of chanting beneath the water. I awoke at dawn, bathed in sweat though it was cold. My breath clung in the air in slow, curved wisps. Downstairs the fire was burning. I hadn't put it on. There was no sign of entry, no dust prints, no open door. The fire had burned low enough to indicate that it had been burning for hours, maybe the whole night. I crept near it, fearing it would disappear if I blinked. But it remained, crackling softly, warm and tangible. On the hearth, someone or something had laid pine cones in a spiral, neat and disquieting in its geometry. There was a bone at its center, small, delicate, childlike. I kicked it into the flames. The flame hissed. The following days slid sideways. Time became soft. Hours stretched out. Mornings dissolved into afternoons unawares. I'd read for 10 minutes, only to see the shadows creep across the floor like wet ink. The books at the cabin were odd. All these handwritten, leather-bound volumes with drawings of plants and animals that were unfamiliar to me. One contained nothing but sketches of eyes, human, animal, unplaceable, all gazing outwards, many with eyes peeled open as if compelled to behold. I started hearing things. Initially at night, pacing footsteps above me despite always being alone. Then whispers, broken phrases just within the range of hearing. A lullaby I never knew, but somehow knew. I would find myself humming it during the day, without knowing when I started. Outside, the woods were off. The same path would change from one walk to the next. Trees I had tagged would disappear. I once discovered my own tracks in the mud, but not where I was walking. They led in a perfect circle around the cabin over and over again so many times the ground had carved out a groove. I attempted to depart, rolled up my bag, filled the car, but the engine coughed once, then twice before it died. The new battery. I examined the cables. Good. The fuel. Full. I sat in the driving seat, gazing at the wheel, when I saw this etched into the dashboard. A symbol. Rough and deep as if it had been gouged in with something pointed. A spiral. That evening, I did not sleep. I remained motionless on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The floor would creak every now and then, but not with weight, not the slow sagging of footsteps. It creaked like a breath. Inhale, exhale. I was convinced the cabin was alive, not metaphorically, but literally. It thrummed with some muted ancient presence. I realized why my family never discussed it. In the attic, hidden behind a false panel in the wall, I discovered the journals. My grandfather's, then older yet, ink worn and pages yellowed. A single entry, unsteady handwriting, the page smelling sweetly of smoke. The ritual is not recalled. It is experienced. The blood is not symbolic. It is due. The cabin is not refuge. It is the altar. It opens when it is ready. It summons when the blood comes back. I did not comprehend it. Not at first. But I read the words repeatedly until they seared into my mind. I could feel them back of my eyes as if they weren't new to me but awakened, inherited, ancestral. I heard my name mentioned that evening, not with lips, not aloud, but in the fire ash, in the wood knots in the walls. It hummed through the floorboards. It hissed through the chimney. It went through me to the marrow. Not a call, but an acknowledgement. I belonged, or something in me did. I awakened outside the next morning. No blanket, no shoes, just bird songs and the weight of cold earth against my back. I rose slowly, frozen with fear. The pine cone spiral had come back, now double in size and closing around me. Along its periphery were more bones, not all animal, some bigger, some broken, some worn down to smoothness by time. I moved out of the spiral. Trees trembled. In the window's reflection, I saw not only myself, but something else, a shadow behind me, but more substantial than the glass. A figure, faceless, tall, arms too long, hands on my shoulders. When I shifted, there was nothing, but I felt them remain. I haven't departed. I don't know how long I've been here, days, weeks. The seasons shift subtly. The sun rises in odd angles. Sometimes the stars are wrong. The fire never goes out now. I wake every morning in a different room, or even outside sometimes. The layout of the cabin shifts while I sleep. Stairs bend where they didn't before. Doors open into closets, or into darkness that goes too far. I walk the spiral patterns now, not because I have to, but because I comprehend. The books talk to me, not in words, but in emotions. The pages breathe, The pictures rearrange themselves when I turn my head away. There is a truth here beyond what the mind can permit. Something ancient, founded not in faith, but in being itself. The cabin is not haunted. It haunts. It is a vessel, a threshold, a scab in the world through which something peers. And it remembers me. I believe I was always destined to come back. Blood never forgets. The spiral is a symbol, not just a thing. It's a map, a downward movement. And I'm so much farther down now. The wall voice no longer whispers, it sings. The wind never blows here, not anymore. The trees are quiet. Even the birds steer clear of this place now. It is quiet, completely quiet. But within the silence, I can hear it all. The scurry of the insects under the bark, the creak of the wood as it draws breath, the hum underneath the floor, deep, rhythmic, and alive. My reflection is different. Eyes are not mine. They are deeper, darker, as if something peers out from inside me. Hands shake, but not with cold. Before long, the cabin will open, really open, and I'll walk through, not away, but deeper, down where the air gets thick, where the chants are louder, where the walls are not of wood, but bone, where the spiral ceases. If you ever see this, burn it. Don't seek out the cabin. Don't go by the coordinates. Don't come. It knows you now. There are places the world forgets, and some that forget the world in return. I found one such place in Hollowmere, where dust tastes like memory and silence has a pulse. I had never heard of the Hollowmere Library, not in any tourist guide, map, or archival reference. It wasn't marked on the university's records or the town's registry. I only found it because I stopped walking when the wind did. That autumn evening had drawn long shadows across the brick alleys of East Grensfield, and I had been wandering aimlessly, in search of inspiration or perhaps distraction. The loss of my father 2 weeks prior had made everything hazy, as though the world had slipped a few notches out of sync, its familiar tune now a dissonant hum. My grief guided my steps more than reason. I found myself taking turns I didn't recall deciding, walking past iron-wrought gates and boarded-up buildings, until I stood before an archway carved into the back of an ivy-choked building. There was no sign, only the smell of cold stone and old parchment, a scent I knew well from the libraries I had buried myself in during university. Something about that arch felt oddly deliberate, like it was always meant to catch my gaze. Beyond it, a narrow stairwell wound downward into shadow. The deeper I descended, the colder the air became, as if the ground itself exhaled frost. When I reached the bottom, the dim light revealed a corridor of decaying oak shelves. And then, I saw the door, a weathered slab of wood, blackened by time, bearing no knob or latch, only a small bronze relief of an open eye, half shut with fatigue or warning. Without understanding why, I pressed my palm against it. The door opened. The library within was ancient, though old feels too soft a word. It wasn't simply aged, it was remembering. The walls remembered voices that hadn't spoken in centuries. The shelves remembered touch. The floorboards remembered footsteps. There was no one there. The silence was not empty but attentive, like I was being observed from behind the very grain of the wood and weave of the tapestries hanging limply along the corridor. I walked slowly, trailing my fingers across spines of books whose titles had faded into obscurity, their scripts foreign, the pages brittle. Light came from somewhere above, yet no fixtures hung from the ceiling. It was a dull, golden glow, sourceless, like the illumination of dreams. I wandered deeper, past reading alcoves filled with ancient armchairs wrapped in the same dust I'd tasted at the entrance. Some were occupied by skeletal forms still bent in study, a few cloaked in tattered robes, their bony hands still clutching open volumes. I recoiled at first, but they did not move, nor did they seem like remnants of violence. They were simply left, forgotten by time or by choice. Perhaps they had read too long. Something about the place drew me onward, though each step felt like a choice made for me. The hallway curved at impossible angles, the geometry subtly off. My sense of direction faltered. Time no longer passed in any recognizable way. I felt neither hunger nor fatigue, only a deepening ache, like longing for something I couldn't name. And then I saw it. The book. It lay on a pedestal of carved black stone in a circular chamber with no visible entrance. I cannot say how I arrived. The chamber was impossibly vast, lined with mirrors that reflected only the pedestal and myself, never the room behind me. The book itself was bound in a material I couldn't name. Rough, fibrous, almost like woven bark or dried muscle. Its cover bore no title, only an embossed spiral that seemed to twist deeper each time I looked at it. I stood before it for a long time, uncertain if I was meant to read it or if it was already reading me. I opened it. The pages were blank, at first. As I turned each one, words began to bleed through, not ink but a kind of growing shadow, as if thoughts themselves were pressing through the fibers of the paper. The language shifted. Some of it resembled Old English, Latin, even ancient Greek. Others were indecipherable scripts that shimmered like mirages, unreadable yet intimate. I understood what I was meant to, and I understood too late. Each passage seemed to speak directly to me, not metaphorically, directly. It recounted events from my past with unearthly precision. The moment my father had died, the color of his hospital sheets, the idle thought I'd had during his final breath. I hope it ends quickly. I had never told anyone that, not even myself. I flipped the page. It described dreams I hadn't remembered until reading them. Long fields of pale grass under a violet sky, distant drums echoing across the hills, a tree with mouths instead of fruit, a woman with no eyes whispering prayers to something beneath the soil. These were my dreams. Some from childhood, others I didn't know I'd had. Page after page. The book peeled back everything I had buried. Then it changed. The book began describing things that hadn't happened, or hadn't happened yet. It showed me wandering deeper into the library, encountering rooms that didn't yet exist. It described me forgetting my name, my past, my body. It detailed how my skin would eventually slough away, page by page, revealing scripture written in my veins. How I would sit in a chair, much like the ones I passed earlier, and read for centuries without food, drink, or death. It described how the book would write itself through me. I tried to shut it. My arms didn't respond. I tried to step away, my legs remained still. I was no longer a man standing before a book. I was a vessel being written into. I blinked, and I was elsewhere. Now, I do not remember leaving the chamber, nor do I recall returning home. But I found myself back in my apartment 3 days later, the calendar ticking forward, though I had no memory of sleep or waking. The book, impossibly, sat on my desk. Smaller now, leather-bound, familiar. Its pages are still blank, but sometimes when I stare too long, I feel the spiraling symbol on the cover pulsing. I hear the shuffling of pages from across the room when no one is near. Once, at midnight, I opened it and found a single sentence written in fine red script. You are being remembered. I've tried to burn it. It will not char. I've tried to bury it. It returns. I once left it inside a locked storage unit across town. I dreamt that night of returning to the library, now filled with new skeletons, all of them me at different ages, clutching the same book. When I woke, it was on my chest. It's been 6 weeks now. I don't sleep anymore. I don't need to. I read. My dreams bleed into the waking world. I see patterns in walls, in trees, in reflections. I hear words murmured in the static between stations on the radio, all of them in that same intimate tone the book once used. Sometimes I wake up in rooms I don't recognize, where the air is too still and the angles are too sharp. I think I am beginning to forget things. My mother's face, the color of the sky, the smell of coffee. I can still feel their absence like a missing tooth, but the details fade more each day. And always, always the book is near. A few nights ago, I dreamt of the spiral again. But this time I wasn't outside it. I was within it. It wasn't a symbol. It was a map, a maze, a cycle. The deeper I traveled, the more I saw. Civilizations built in darkness, rituals conducted beneath twin moons, a language spoken by the stars before there were mouths to speak it. I understood then that the library was not built to hold knowledge. It was built to contain something, and every reader becomes a lock, or a key. Now I sit here writing this, unsure whether I'm warning you or fulfilling the next page of the book. Because the last time I opened it, just this morning, it said, "You will tell someone, and they will read." If you are still reading this, it's too late. The library remembers you now. You will dream of staircases that lead beneath your home, of pages turning without hands, of ancient voices behind your walls. You will find the book, or it will find you. And when you do, you will think you're reading it. But in truth, it's reading you. You are being remembered. They never found the bus. Only the twisted signpost at the fork in the road, and the bones scattered like wind-blown ash beneath the trees. I remember the cold most of all, an unnatural cold, not the kind you feel in your skin, but deeper, bone-seated, as though your blood itself has recoiled from something it doesn't want to recognize. Our high school trip was supposed to be a celebration, a final memory before we scattered into adulthood like leaves caught in separate gusts. The school called it a senior autumn retreat, and it sounded benign enough. A weekend in the old forest lodge by Caro Hill, somewhere north of the counties where signal fades and the stars are sharper than anywhere I've ever seen. We'd pack into a chartered bus, drive for hours past leafless fields and frost-laced woods, and spend 2 nights disconnected from the world. That's how they sold it to us. But what we found wasn't a retreat. It was a thinning. The trip began like any other. Laughter, bags stuffed with snacks and Bluetooth speakers, the smell of cologne and chewing gum saturating the stale bus air. I was seated by the window, my cheek pressed to the cool glass, watching the trees darken as we passed deeper into a region I didn't recognize. My classmates dozed or played cards. Mr. Hallworth, our chaperone, nursed coffee from a chipped thermos in the front seat. I remember thinking how strange the trees looked. Thin, stretched unnaturally tall, their limbs pale and bare like bleached bone. And the road. It seemed to twist with a slow, deliberate motion, not like it was following the land, but like the land itself was leading us somewhere. We arrived just past dusk. The lodge was a squat stone building nestled between steep hills. It looked abandoned. Windows gaped without curtains. The roof was a sagging mass of moss and rotted shingles. No lights, no caretakers. But the driver, his face already half-shadowed by the falling night, said this was it, gestured vaguely, and climbed back into the bus without a word. None of us questioned it. Not really. Looking back, I wonder if something was already affecting us. Not controlling exactly, just numbing. Inside, the lodge was strangely dry despite the surrounding damp. Dust lay thick on the floor, but the furniture seemed untouched by time. Armchairs without wear, tables that gleamed faintly in the dim light of our phones. It was cold, but not in a normal way. The air felt close, like breathing through wet wool. My lungs resisted. We claimed rooms on the second floor. Mine had a slanted ceiling, a window that wouldn't open, and a single bed dressed in coarse, brittle sheets that crackled when I lay down. I didn't sleep. None of us did, I think. Later, we all confessed to hearing things. Soft footsteps across floorboards that shouldn't creak, breathing behind the walls, a single bell tolling far in the forest. Always just one bell, low and slow, like it mourned something long forgotten. That first night blurred into waking dreams. I saw things. No, felt them. Images that weren't mine, sliding into my thoughts like knives into soft earth. A mouthless figure kneeling in the woods, children with no eyes, hands clasped in prayer. A hill crowned in fire and the silhouettes of antlered men dancing around it. I awoke to a nosebleed and the copper taste of something older than blood. By the second day, the group had splintered. No one laughed anymore. Some wandered into the forest, despite warnings. We found one girl hours later, kneeling by a stream, murmuring in a language none of us recognized. She didn't respond when we touched her. Her eyes were empty, not vacant, used, as if something else had looked out through them and left them hollow. Mr. Hallworth was nowhere to be found. His belongings remained in his room, his coat still warm, his notebook left open on the desk. I read it once. The handwriting changed halfway through. Not just sloppier, but different. Angled, as if written with trembling fingers, or claws. The last entry read only, "There's something in the walls, it remembers us." That night I wandered, not out of curiosity, out of compulsion. The air felt thick, sweet with rot and pine sap. The hallway outside my room seemed longer than before. Each step echoed with the sound of many steps, my own and others, delayed by a half-second, as if I was being followed by the future. I descended the main staircase and found myself in the lodge basement. No one told us there was a basement. The door was behind the pantry, masked by shelves, old, iron-bound. It opened without resistance, and the stairwell inside descended at an impossible angle, winding too long, far longer than the depth of the building could allow. I don't remember walking down. Only the moment when the air changed, heavier, scented with soil and iron and something else. Something sickly sweet, like fermenting fruit. At the bottom, there was a chamber. Stone walls, black with moss and old carvings. Symbols like twisted runes, scratched deep and bleeding tar. At the center sat a bell. It was enormous, taller than a man, made of bronze or something older, dull with age, but still pulsing faintly with warmth. It didn't ring, but it hummed, low, constant, like a heartbeat stretched across centuries. I remember standing before it and feeling like I'd always been there, that I'd always known this place, that the trip was just a pretext, a way to return to something my blood remembered even if my mind did not. The others joined me one by one. No words, just a gathering. We stood around the bell, silent, waiting, and then we saw it. Not with eyes, not truly. It moved between the cracks in the stone, a mass of colorless limbs and weeping mouths, antlers like dead trees. It had no form, not one that stayed fixed, but it filled the chamber with its presence like a flood through a broken dam. My breath left me, not from fear, but from recognition. I knew it. We all did. And it knew us. There was no scream, no attack, no bloodshed, only understanding, like waking up and remembering you've already died once. When I woke the next morning, I was alone. The others were gone. Not missing. Gone. Their rooms empty. The furniture undisturbed, as if they had never existed. The bus was gone too. The forest had crept closer in the night. I could see the tree line from the window now, closer than it had any right to be. Branches scratched the glass. I walked the halls in silence. Each room revealed some new impossibility. A dining room filled with chairs, each turned to the wall. A library where the books were blank. A bathroom where the mirror reflected an empty hallway that wasn't behind me. No exit. Every door led inward, every path deeper. At some point I stopped eating. The hunger faded, replaced by something else. A pull, like gravity turned inward. Dreams came again. Not dreams. Messages, warnings, invitations. I saw the bell again. Always the bell. And beneath it, the thing. Not waiting, not hunting, beckoning. I don't know how long I stayed in that lodge. Time fractured. Days bled into one another. The sky outside never changed. Always a slate gray twilight. Lightless, yet not dark. The wind stopped. The birds vanished. Even the insects were silent. Then, one morning, I found myself outside. I don't remember walking out. But I stood at the tree line, the lodge behind me, its windows black and unblinking. The forest was still, no path, no road, just brambles and moss and stone. I walked. I walked for what felt like weeks. Through fog and frost, through glades where nothing grew. I drank from streams that tasted like bone. I slept beneath trees older than names. I saw others, sometimes. Not people. Shadows wearing people's skin. They didn't speak, only watched. Eventually I came upon the signpost. It was twisted, the words eroded. But I recognized it. It was the fork where we had turned from the main road, and beneath it scattered like seeds were bones, human, youthful, a dozen or more, too many. I collapsed there, not from pain, from relief. It was over. I was back. Someone found me days later, a hunter. He didn't speak English. He only stared at me with wide, pale eyes, crossed himself, and led me in silence to the nearest road. That was 3 years ago. They say the school never scheduled a trip. No records, no bus logs, no missing persons report. My classmates' families swear they never had children. The school building itself was demolished last year. I visited the site. Only a vacant lot remained, overgrown and fenced in. I don't sleep well anymore. The bell still calls to me in my dreams, and sometimes, not in dreams. Sometimes I hear it in waking life, soft and distant like thunder beneath the skin of the world. Always one toll, never more. A reminder. There are places that are not places, times that are not times, and names we once knew before we were born. We weren't the first to hear the bell. We won't be the last. Somewhere in the depths of a forest that no map remembers, it waits. Patient, eternal. And when you hear it too, you'll understand what I mean. You'll remember. And you'll return, like all of us do. It began with the scent of jasmine, too sweet, too sudden, drifting through my cracked bedroom window at 3:11 a.m. I had never planted jasmine. I remember sitting up, pulled from sleep not by sound, but by a sensation, like someone had leaned over my bed and whispered my name without making a sound. There was a thickness to the night air that didn't belong, like the humidity that settles before a hurricane. My apartment, a modest second-floor unit on the edge of Winter Garden, Florida, had always been quiet, uneventful, even boring. I chose it for exactly that reason. I wanted solitude. I didn't want reminders. The garden wasn't there when I moved in. Not the one I found the next morning, at least. It's not unusual to dream of gardens. Lush, ordered rows of color. Bees drifting lazily from petal to petal. The rhythmic pulse of wind moving through grass. But what I found was nothing like that. At sunrise, the scent of jasmine hadn't left. If anything, it had intensified, crowding every breath I took, coating my throat with a floral sweetness that felt almost artificial. I stepped out back to investigate. My apartment overlooked a small, neglected patch of land, a scrubby, unused common space bordered by a decaying chain-link fence. But that morning, the patch had changed. Where there had been trash and cracked earth the day before, a garden had sprung up overnight. I'm not exaggerating, it wasn't there on Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, it was fully grown. Neatly arranged flower beds lined the perimeter. Topiary animals, Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, even the unmistakable silhouette of Cinderella's castle, stood in the center, sculpted from dense, dark green hedges with impossible precision. Everything about it looked curated, manufactured, like something pulled straight from Epcot, then left to wilt under a stranger's care. But it wasn't decaying. It pulsed with life. Not insects, not bird song. No sound at all. Just growth. Silent, creeping growth. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? A garden appearing overnight. Hedge sculptures in Disney shapes. The smell of jasmine lingering for days, clinging to clothes, to furniture, to my skin. My rational mind, what was left of it, chalked it up to some strange art installation. Maybe a local trying to draw attention to environmentalism. Maybe an eccentric retiree with a topiary obsession. But that didn't explain how it had appeared overnight, or how it grew deeper and wider with each passing hour. By Friday, it extended several feet beyond the fence line. I stopped going outside. Stranger things followed. The dreams began first. Subtle at first. Lush fields under violet skies. Birds with human hands nesting in branches overhead. Dreams so vivid, I woke up sweating, confused about where I was. Then the whispers started. Always just outside the edge of hearing, like someone whispering through the walls, not from the other side of them. And always, the scent. Stronger now. Cloying. Rotting sweet. I tried sleeping with the windows closed. I ran the AC full blast, sealed the doors. It made no difference. The smell found me. One night, I woke to find the walls of my bedroom damp with condensation. My sheets were soaked. My carpet squelched beneath my feet. The garden, when I checked it, was no longer confined to the backyard. It had pushed past the fence, curling upward like fingers reaching toward my unit. Ivy now threaded the window frames. The topiaries had turned. No longer joyful caricatures, their heads now tilted unnaturally, their arms bent in impossible ways. The castle stood taller than before, casting a jagged shadow across my building like a sundial made for the dead. I tried to report it. The city said the land behind my unit was unzoned. No owner, no developer, no record of permits or landscaping. I called code enforcement. No response. I emailed photos to the building manager. When she finally replied, her message was brief. There is no garden. I read it twice, then a third time. I sent the photos again. No reply. The next day, my email account was locked. My login credentials changed. I called her cell. Disconnected. I drove to her office. It was gone. Not closed. Not empty. Gone. Replaced by a dry cleaner I'd never seen before. Same address. New name. A mural of Disney characters painted on the front wall. The figures were wrong. Eyes too large. Teeth too sharp. They looked almost mummified, like someone had tried to preserve joy and ended up freezing agony. By the end of that week, the garden had reached my window. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I started hearing the music. Not clearly, like an old phonograph playing through layers of cotton, distorted, slowed down, dragging across the wrong notes. At first I thought it was my mind buckling under insomnia, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It's a small world, after all. Slurred, reversed, stretched into a dirge. Sometimes I heard a carousel turning. Other times, the whine of animatronics moving, joint by hydraulic joint. But no voices, no joy. Only the mechanisms of delight, stripped of their humanity. Saturday night I found a door in my closet, not metaphorically. A real door. It hadn't been there before. My closet had a fixed back wall. I had lived in that unit nearly 8 months. I kept old books, boxes, Christmas decorations there. But now, behind a line of hanging coats, a door. Wooden, pale white, with a brass handle shaped like a cartoon glove. The smell behind it was suffocating. I didn't open it. Not then. But I didn't sleep either. I sat on the floor with my back against the closet, holding a kitchen knife I didn't remember retrieving. Every light on. The television turned to static. My ears rang. My eyes wouldn't close. Every time I blinked, I saw flashes of that garden. But not as it was outside, as it once had been, as it had always been. There's something about Florida most people don't understand. Beneath the polished veneer of resorts and theme parks, it's an old place. Ancient, even. Swamps that remember things. Cypress groves older than memory. And under those, deeper still. Roots. Not just plant roots, memory roots. Something was buried here long before the mouse ever built his kingdom. Something older than cartoons, older than names. And now it was growing again. feeding on nostalgia like compost. I researched, deep dives into digital archives, obscure forums, strange local legends. The further I searched, the more elusive the truth became. Mentions of a Disney garden appeared only in whispers, rumors of a prototype that predated Disneyland. Not a park, not a ride. A ritual, a place to preserve happiness. But happiness rots. You can't bottle it, you can't build walls around it. It seeps, it ferments, it grows teeth. One post, deleted minutes after I bookmarked it, read, "They planted it in Winter Garden first, before Anaheim, before Orlando. But the garden grew wrong. It remembered things it shouldn't." I opened the door Sunday night. I didn't mean to. I just woke up standing in front of it, hand on the handle, breath shallow. The air around me felt dense, heavy, like I was underwater. The floor pulsed beneath me like a heartbeat. I opened it. Inside, a staircase spiraled downward. Not steps. A gradual sloped ramp like the entrance to a ride, dimly lit by flickering lanterns shaped like fairy wings. The walls were velvet, stitched with cartoon faces, every expression twisted in mid-laugh, eyes open too wide, mouths frozen in something not quite joy. I walked. I don't know how long I walked. The path curved and curved until I lost track of time. Hours, days. The scent of jasmine thickened, fermenting into something darker, like sweet wine soured into vinegar. At the end, a door of vines. Living vines. Breathing. It parted at my approach. The garden on the other side was vast, infinite. A nighttime landscape lit by a sickly moon, casting shadows too sharp for reality. Rows and rows of topiary figures danced silently, some familiar, others long forgotten. Characters from failed rides, abandoned projects, Disney's graveyard of ideas. They turned to face me, not move, turn all at once, and in the center of them the castle. But not the version you know. This one bled. Its spires melted into themselves like wax. Its walls were made of bone-white stone that shimmered like wet teeth. Music echoed from within, disjointed lullabies and reversed melodies layered over one another until they became a single trembling hum. I should have run. I didn't. I stepped forward. There was no welcome, no fanfare. Just the quiet, terrible understanding that I had been expected, that this place had always known me, had been reaching for me for years. Every trip to the parks as a child, every VHS tape worn down to static, every plush toy I clung to through fevered nights. It had remembered me. I walked until I stood before the castle. The gates opened without sound. Inside, a garden, a real one, perfectly maintained, flowers arranged by color, height, theme, butterflies pinned in midair, unmoving. The air was colder here, sharpened by the scent of rust and dying flowers. At the center, a statue, me, not a likeness. Me. Stone carved in perfect lifeless detail, eyes open, lips parted, one hand raised in greeting, or surrender. I screamed. No sound emerged, only the creaking whine of a carousel starting somewhere in the dark beyond the castle walls. I woke in my bed, morning sunlight spilling through the window, the scent of jasmine, gone. My phone worked again. My email. The building manager responded, cheerful as ever. The garden behind my unit? Just dirt and weeds. No trace of topiary, no creeping ivy, no music. But the closet door remains, and I still wake up at 3:11 a.m. Not from sound, from presence, from breath on my neck, from the quiet hum of a carousel far below the floorboards. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see them waiting. Not behind me. Within me. Payoff. People talk about nostalgia like it's comfort, a return to innocence, a retreat from the world's harshness. But what if that retreat leads somewhere else? What if the things we remember us too? The Disney garden wasn't meant to entertain, it was meant to preserve. But joy preserved too long becomes something else, something dry, something brittle, something hollowed out by time and desperate for warmth. Now I live carefully. I don't speak of it aloud. I no longer sleep in the dark, but I know, deep down, it will find a way to bloom again. Not outside, inside. Because that's the thing about gardens. Once planted, they never truly die. They only wait.